And we're back from the break. Guess who's joined us from her sickbed? Tasnim, sick and here in the studio, ready to record our feature on Palestine. Now, if that's not martyring herself for the cause, I don't know what is.
Well, the cause is pretty important, Miran, to be honest. This week's episode, inshallah, will feature on Palestine. Now, the Arab Spring, we've been covering, the uprisings, the revolutions in the Middle East, and it seems, so inspiring and, awesome, right? But the question on everybody's mind is, okay, Palestine, what's happening there exactly? And I think in the last week we've actually seen a taste of what exactly is going on in Palestine.
I think the news coming out of Palestine this past week has been fascinating. Now, most of you already probably know that it's the anniversary of the Nakba, which translates loosely to catastrophe.
Basically, that was when Israel declared its state, and over 800,000 people were deported into camps into neighbouring countries such as Lebanon, Syria, Jordan and Egypt. And basically, 60 years on, this number has actually totaled to around 5 million. And these people are basically displaced Palestinians. They have no rights and they have no privileges. They're stateless people.
Now, this week, you've had that Arab Spring that you were referring to before, Tasnim. It hasn't slowed down, not in the least. I mean, we were wondering whether it would spread to Palestine, especially on this occasion. And it's very interesting to find what they're calling the third intifada starting up. But I think the different thing about it is that they've insisted on having a very peaceful one, like the organisers of it, who, by the way, have been using Facebook and social networking, as with all the Arab revolutions, to organise this. They just pretty much marched up towards the Israeli fences and the Israeli borders, and they even some of them were throwing rocks, and then the organisers would get them to stop and say, no, this is a non-violent demonstration. We just want our rights back. We want our land back, but we're not going to be violent to get them, as opposed to the Israeli military, which reacted obviously in violence.
Definitely, and there's been many
deaths and injuries
today.
Yeah, I mean, if you have a look at it, like what happens was you have the Palestinian camps in Lebanon, and you have some of them in Jordan and Syria. And you know how there's the Golan Heights in Syria, which I think is technically occupied by Israel. So protests broke out in all of those places, as well as in Egypt, where you had masses and masses of people going to the Israeli embassy. It's very interesting that rather than supporting all of these people in their protests for Palestine, the government's pretty much cracked down on them. So in Syria, the government was attacking the protesters. In Jordan, the government was attacking the protesters. In Egypt, there were 350 injured and 150 arrested for protesting, which is quite interesting because one would imagine that after the revolution, they wouldn't really be faced by crackdowns for supporting Palestine. But there's just been, all these reactions by the government and the officials of these countries against it.
I think, Miran, also the way it's being reported, right? With most of the Middle East, it was like, these benevolent freedom fighters, taking down the regime and things like that. But the way the Palestinian revolution or the protests are being reported is in a very, very different way. Now, I think this stems from, honestly, the problem with Palestine, and it's a very, very sticky legal, political, sociological, historical situation. Just on the 18th of May, a minister in Israel by the name of Gilad Erdan came out, and basically he said that if there was a unilateral declaration of independence by the Palestinians, that breaks, quote unquote, the rules of the game, and hence he's calling for part of the occupied West Bank to be annexed by the Zionist state as a result. So you have to realize, like, these protests are taking place in the backdrop of many heated political debates. The UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees just stated the other day that Israeli demolitions of Palestinians' houses have doubled basically in the last year, right? Mm-hmm. So it just shows, you think we're progressing and peace talks and things like that, but the reality of the situation is what's actually happening in Palestine is just horrendous.
And it's only getting worse because at the moment, the number of people outside of Palestine who are Palestinian are estimated to be 4.7 million. It was only 760,000 who'd originally been, who fled Palestine in 1948. Now they're 4.7 million. And just imagine, all of these people outside of their country displaced.
and they're not granted any legal rights, and when they complain, they're labelled as terrorists and, you know, troublemakers, and basically people that don't, you know, give Israel the space it needs to live. You know, it's just...
It's
baffling.
atrocious, but I mean, so that's why we're dedicating today's episode to Palestine, and inshallah we're going to be speaking to someone from the Solidarity magazine about Palestinian issues. We're also going to speak to a flotilla survivor, and inshallah after the break Amatullah will be talking about Palestine from an Islamic perspective, and she too will have a guest on the show. So stick around for all that, and coming up is our first interview.
The Y Factor.
Joining us in the studio today is Amy from Solidarity magazine. Welcome to the Y Factor, Amy.
Thank you.
As we were mentioning earlier on the show, this week has been a very interesting week in the development in Palestine. So we were just wondering if you can give us your view on things.
Yeah, well, I think, I mean, obviously on Sunday was the anniversary of the Nakba, but I think what we saw as well on Sunday was some extremely inspirational protests that were challenging Israel's borders, but also demanding the right of return for refugees who were expelled in 1948. And it seems to me that what we're seeing at the moment is, you know, the Arab Spring that brought down Mubarak and Ben Ali in Tunisia, like the possibility
it's spreading to Palestine.
Yeah.
Amy, obviously, you know, there are grievances in this region, and obviously you mentioned the Nakba and the Intifada and all these things that have happened. But what are the grievances of the people in this area?
Well, I think since 1948, you've had 63 years of state terror, you know, from the State of Israel. That's what I would call it. And you've had 20 years of a so-called peace process, which I just think is an extremely misnamed thing, where you've had consistently, you know, the Israeli settlers in, you know, incursions onto Palestinian land, the building of the apartheid wall, like these things have gone on. And I think in the last decade, when you've seen the US intervene, well, intervene's a polite word for it, in Iraq and Afghanistan and everything like that, people feeling like they're constantly under siege by Israel and the United States. And they are, you know, Israel's the fourth biggest military in the world, backed by the biggest military in the world, that's consistently doing everything they can to make daily life extremely hard for Palestinians. So Israel, I think, controls nearly every aspect of life, you know, in Palestine. The checkpoints, you know, all of that sort of stuff. Like so many stories of people just doing, you know, trying to do basic everyday things and having to spend hours waiting on checkpoints to go to school or go to work, you know, to get paid below the minimum wage. You know, there's no free trade unions inside Palestine, for example. The workers have no proper rights. All of this sort of stuff that just, you know, grinds people down every single day, not to mention the huge amounts of people living inside the refugee camps around the region. But I think because of what's going on at the moment, that there's a hope and a feeling that things can change, because you've seen simply through, I think, you know, popular power, strikes, demonstrations, you've seen people bring down one of the biggest, you know, dictators in the Middle East, and the possibility to bring down more of them all the time emerging. And I think people are starting to say, actually, we can do this in Palestine as well. And also the people who've participated in those protests, you know, the protests in Egypt, the protests in Syria and things like that, feeling like actually we can express our solidarity with Palestine as well. Like we can use, you know, the kind of steps forward we've had in our country to push for more justice for Palestine. Like there's people in Egypt
Definitely,
saying, close the Israeli embassy, you know, all of that sort of
Even
stuff.
during the actual revolution in Egypt, I remember, you know, watching the Al Jazeera footage, many of the protesters had Palestine will never forget you. Like they're trying to do their own thing, but Palestine was also always an issue for them, you know, in the back of their minds. I think the interesting about Palestine is at the moment the fact that it's actually a popular revolution, if you would name it a revolution. It's not so much as orchestrated by political power, parties in power.
But Tasnim, wouldn't you say that the intifadas in Palestine have always been a popular power movement? I mean, it's always been the people out there just trying to regain their land. So what makes it different this year?
Well, I think what's different this year is that you have the active solidarity from people all around the Arab world. Like you had that in 1987, but I think very mistakenly the leadership of the Palestinian movement, Fatah, told people, you know, don't demonstrate in Egypt and in the Gulf and in Sudan and things like that. But now people, I think, are not paying that much attention to the political leadership and doing things for themselves, which I think is what they need to do. I think they need to push beyond what I consider the failed strategies of organisations like Fatah in the West Bank anyway, and to say, you know, we, instead of allying ourselves with, you know, because Fatah's strategy for a long time has been to say, we'll ally ourselves with Syria or we'll ally ourselves with, you know, someone like that. And even Hamas to some extent has done that. But people are saying, actually, we don't want to ally ourselves with the rulers. We want to ally ourselves with the people.
Definitely.
And that's what's happening at the moment. And I think that's what's so powerful about it, because you look at Egypt, you see this huge working class that has the power to do all kinds of active solidarity with Palestine, and it petrifies Israel. These people can go on strike and say, halt the gas exports.
Yeah.
They can do it. They can literally open the border themselves. And these things are not happening yet, but I think you see the possibility, like the fear that held people back, it's broken. People are talking about doing all kinds of
So you really think that Israel feels quite threatened at the moment?
Yeah, I think so.
It's really interesting because at the moment Israel is fearing on two fronts. The first front is with the recent Hamas-Fatah deal, the peace deal. As we were mentioning a couple of episodes ago, they've basically frozen the wages of so many people because they're protesting against this unity.
Yes,
and obviously we have our own reservations in regards to that, but still, it was a substantial unity. And the second thing they are fearing is a popular uprising. And it's really interesting the way the news portrays the Palestinians, because, all around the Middle East, they were kind of seen as like revolutionaries and freedom fighters and things like that. But when it came to the coverage of the Palestinians, and I think today something like 19 or 20 people have been killed in that region, they're portrayed as, like, not even, I don't know how to say it, but...
Well, definitely not revolutionary.
Definitely like troublemakers, and, they're breaching Israel's security. Like, why is the discourse in relation to Palestine always so negative and, like, laden,
Well, I think because, for example, here in Australia, it threatens the leadership of the political parties here. Like, the Australian Labor Party, just as much as the Australian Liberal Party, has pursued a military alliance with the United States. It supports their occupation of Afghanistan. We've withdrawn troops from Iraq, but we still support the occupation of Iraq by the troops, by the United States Army. Australia has, as much as a reliance on Israel as it's, I consider Israel to be, the US watchdog in the Middle East, like keeping its eye out for US interests, keeping the profits flowing for the massive oil companies and things like that, and keeping the Arab populations down. And that's what it's tried to do for the last 60 years. And I think Australia has as much, a certain section of Australian political life thinks that is what needs to happen. But in order to justify that, because it is, when you actually look at the facts, it is an extremely cruel, horrific, barbaric, imperialist kind of thing that they've got going on. To justify that, you have to demonise the Palestinians. You have to say these people, are terrorists. These people are, they won't settle their conflicts. It's about religion, etc., etc. They try to do as much as they can to deflect from the actual reality, And I think as much as people read The Australian and things like that, those newspapers are going to push that narrative as well. But I think even despite that, here in countries like Australia, people see through that. There's a massive amount of support, I think, for what happened in Egypt. But even if you look at, last year, Israel's disgraceful attack on the flotilla, thousands of people, on the streets in Sydney in a very short period of time. There is a sentiment out there to support Palestine, and I think the more that the revolutions push on inside the Middle East, and the more all the hypocrisies of the West are shown, the more that we can do here to sort of to build that support, I think.
Well, you were speaking about popular, rallying the masses. There was a conference, I believe, on Palestine at UTS.
Yeah, just on the weekend, the last weekend past. There are a number of speakers, like lots of academics and things like that, but also a woman from the General Trade Union Federation in Palestine. And a lot of the discussion was about, okay, what does the Arab Spring mean for Palestine? Talking about the possibility of, of popular power, of active solidarity from Egypt and things like that. And I think it had people are feeling inspired. I've sort of felt over in particular the last 10 years, as I said, after September 11, the occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan and the kind of the demonisation of, Palestinians and other organisations in the Middle East as terrorists and so forth. You've had things have been pushed back a little bit, but I think all of that's starting to turn around. The US has been saying for years they're for democracy and freedom and human rights in the Middle East, but now people are really fighting for democracy and human rights and things like that.
And that's worrying them.
Exactly. They're left, trying, I think, to sort of change their relationships a little bit so they can put themselves back in the picture. But I think Israel and the United States are on the back foot, and I think people can see that, and they're inspired at the moment.
Okay, well, as we always do every year on this occasion, we sit and we talk about the problems in Palestine, and I think they're pretty well known by now. But what people tend to neglect discussing is what we can do. from our comfort, the comfort of our homes in Australia or wherever in the world you may be, what can we do to assist other people in Palestine?
And especially with our audience, being young people. I mean, in Egypt they're causing revolutions and here we are listening to it. Like, what can we do as young people, in your view, to help the Palestinian cause, I guess?
Well, I go to UTS, and there's just been a recent campus group started up called UTS Students for Justice in Palestine. So I encourage people to have a look at that. It's on Facebook. But if they're not at UTS themselves, to do similar things, like particularly, I'm sure lots of your listeners are university students or school students. Start up groups in your school, things like that. Get involved. Like there's actually quite a lot of activities that go on, around solidarity with Palestine. There's the campaign for boycott, divestment and sanctions, and as well as that, there's actually this coming Thursday outside Max Brenner in Parramatta at 5:00. There's going to be a protest to draw attention to Max Brenner's role in supporting the Israeli army. So I think there's so many things you can do to be involved in active solidarity for Palestine. But I also think here in Australia, anything that we can do to make obvious our government's role, in this apartheid in the Middle East, but also to end the fight to end the occupations of Afghanistan and Iraq, to fight against the racism that they push towards refugees who come here from Iraq and Afghanistan, of all places. I think that contradicts so many of the things they say about what they're doing in the Middle East, that so many of the people who come here on boats are from these countries that they're supposedly bringing democracy to. So I think there's so many things that people can do, and I think if people want to see these kinds of changes, that we need to do everything we can here in Australia to try to push back that agenda. So I really do encourage people to get involved.
Definitely.
That's definitely valuable advice. Thank you very much for joining us today, Amy. That was quite insightful.
No problems.
The Why Factor.